Okay, this evening we're looking at Ian Paisley, and I ought to say from the beginning, I almost regret picking him. It's not because I don't admire him any less, it's because there is such a quantity of material that I'm not sure I can do him justice, actually. And the other thing is, because he died only recently, I know a number of people in here have met him and perhaps even spent some time with him, whereas I am speaking as an outsider, as an ignoramus. So I imagine there's going to be a number of things this evening I'm going to miss out. So I'm going to try and cover myself here and call it an introduction to Ian Paisley, and that way nobody can get upset. Okay, so I want to divide this evening into 5 areas. The first one is a brief and very simple view of Irish history. And I don't want it to be just like a school lesson today. But I don't think we can understand Ian Paisley without understanding the context of Irish history. I want to look at him as a politician, but I don't want to focus upon that because he was more than that. We're going to look at him as an actual Christian believer, as a Christian leader, and then some of the controversial issues with which he was involved. So let's just spend a little time considering Irish history. And Irish history, I think, is particularly sad. And it's chiefly sad, I think, because of the English. And it might be that you've been to Ireland, and it is a gorgeous country. It is green and it's lush, and the people seem to be very, very friendly. But what we need to understand is that the area at the top, where my mouse is moving now, not that top bit, but this bit here, those 6 northern counties, they're called Ulster, right? And that is a term which Ian Paisley used a great deal. So Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, and the rest of Ireland, what we might call the Republic or the South, is its own separate independent nation. But back in Norman times, the English invaded Ireland. I think 1165 it began. And certainly the area around Dublin was the most English, and it was called the Pale. And it's where we still sometimes use the expression, outside of the Pale or beyond the Pale. In other words, out of the English area and into the barbaric kind of Irish area. And there we have the Irish harp, a symbol of Ireland. We still find it on some of our coins. Unfortunately, during English rule, there were some statutes called the Statutes of Kilkenny in the 14th century, which were discriminatory against the Irish. And you can see that there has been a dislike of Britain and the English in particular from Ireland. There we have Henry VIII. Henry VIII, of course, we know, broke from the Church of Rome. And he considered himself a king of Ireland as well. And he imposed the Reformation upon Ireland. Again, that's another reason why the Irish were never too fond of the English. And there we have at the bottom a picture of the Spanish Armada. Now, the Spanish Armada, in one respect, had nothing to do with Ireland, but certainly Ireland was considered the staging post for when the Catholic powers of Europe would invade England. And so, from the Irish point of view, the English were foreign, they were oppressive, and they're of the wrong religion. From the English point of view, the Irish are barbaric and backwards, and they still belong to the Church of Rome. Now, early in the 1600s, something happened, the plantations of Ulster, and Scotsmen were encouraged to leave Scotland and were given land in the north of Ireland. Now, that is significant because it accounts for why there is a slim Protestant majority there. You can also tell, I think, the difference between North and South in accent. In the southern in the Republic of Ireland, they talk a little bit like that. It is light and it is musical, whereas in the north it is rather more nasal. And that is because it is an Irish accent with a strong Scottish influence. So outside of Ulster, the majority of people are Roman Catholic. Within Ulster, the majority, although not a huge majority, are Protestant. Now, bearing in mind, if you're Irish, that's yet another reason to dislike the English monarchy, because it encouraged the Scotsmen to move and take land, the best land of people in Ireland. In the 1640s, there was a rebellion against English rule, and thousands of Protestants were murdered and massacred. We don't really know how many were involved. But what we do know is that Oliver Cromwell in 1649 invaded Ireland, partly because of vengeance and partly to save the Protestant population. Now, some of you have already worked out, I'm rather a fan of Oliver Cromwell, and Ian Paisley was as well. But certainly for people in the South, for Irish Roman Catholics, Oliver Cromwell really is a bogeyman. He is a figure of hate. And that is because in response to the Irish Rebellion of 1641, Cromwell violently subdued Ireland. The town of Drogheda in particular was butchered, and priests died horrible deaths there. So why am I telling you all this? Because I want you to understand why in Ireland, especially in the north, where the Catholics have not got independence, there is a real antipathy of anything Protestant and English, or favouring the English. From the Roman Catholic Irish point of view, Cromwell, English, Protestant means invader and persecution. From the English Protestant point of view, or the Northern Irish Protestant point of view, Catholic means he brings up memories of the rebellion of 1641, of loyalty to the Pope of Rome, and of being opposed to Protestant freedom. Now, the two gentlemen with long hair at the top, that is James Stuart, also known as James II. And to his right is William III, William of Orange. Now, in 1688, the Parliament in London decided it would get rid of the Stuart family as being monarchs of England, because they were, or certainly James was Catholic. And they invited over a Dutchman who was related to the English royal family, called King William. They had a battle in Ireland called the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And William won. And the upshot of that is that the English monarchy remained a Protestant institution from that time forward. And Catholics were no longer represented at royal level. And there is an organisation in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and in England. There is a branch in Burnley, in Blackburn, in Preston, called the Loyal Orange Order. And Orange, of course, remains the royal family of Holland. And the Orangemen go marching on the 12th of July every year to celebrate the Battle of the Boyne, of Protestant King Billy beating Papist King Jimmy. And they have a habit of marching through predominantly Roman Catholic areas. Now, in Northern Ireland, people tend to live according to sectarian boundaries. Now, my next door neighbour is a Roman Catholic. The house next to him is a Muslim family. And it doesn't really make a lot of difference to me. Of course, I want them both to come to Christ, but I don't move to an area because it's full of evangelicals or Congregationalists. It sounds like a good idea, but I don't think it would work out. In Northern Ireland, if you're Protestant, you live together. If you're Roman Catholic, you live together. And the controversy of the marching is that the marches often go through Roman Catholic areas. Now, what we have on this slide is an explanation of our flag. Now, I hope you come away with more tonight than this, but there you go. So when England and Scotland merged their parliaments, or merged their crowns in 1606, the flag of St. George and the saltire of St. Andrew were merged. In 1801, the saltire of St. Patrick also merged onto what we call the Union flag. So you've got the flags of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, anyone who's astute might notice that the Welsh dragon is not there. And it's not because we don't like the Welsh. It is because Wales has never been a kingdom. It's only ever been a principality. And that is the flag of the United Kingdoms, the United Kingdom of England, of Scotland, of Ireland. And that is our flag. In 1845, there was something called the potato famine. And many thousands of people in Ireland perished because they only had one crop, and that was potatoes. And potato blight developed, and the crops rotted in the ground. Unfortunately, the government in London did very, very little to help. Its attitude was that it's not the government's job to feed the starving. It's the government's job to pass laws and prevent foreign invasion, but apart from that, nothing else. As a result, not only did many Irish people starve, but many of them emigrated to America. Some came to Liverpool, some went to Glasgow, which is why you've got large Catholic populations in those towns. But those people took off with them a dislike of the United Kingdom. Perhaps not so much the ones who went to Liverpool, but certainly those in Glasgow and those who went to America. Now, in 1922, after the First World War, the Irish Free State was founded. So what became the Republic broke away from the United Kingdom and became a separate nation. And that became fully the case in 1937. It became a republic. However, the majority of people in the north wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, again, generally speaking, we do not vote according to religious belief. So it can't be said that evangelical Christians vote Liberal and Catholics vote Labour and Jehovah's Witnesses vote Conservative. They don't vote at all. But certainly in Ireland, if you are a Protestant, you almost certainly vote Unionist. That means you vote to remain part of the United Kingdom. If you are a Roman Catholic in Ireland, you probably vote Nationalist. That means you want the northern bit of Ireland, that bit there, to join the rest of the Republic. So there we've got the Union flag. It might be worth also commenting upon the Irish tricolour. You can see in that propaganda poster from 1921 that has Britain yanking Northern Ireland apart from the rest of Ireland. You've got orange, you've got white, and you've got green. Now, green is not only the colour of Ireland, but it's considered the colour of Roman Catholicism. White is the colour of peace and tranquility, and orange, of course, is the colour of Protestantism, because it is the colour of the House of Orange, William of Orange, the Loyal Orange Order. So not only is the British flag or the United Kingdom flag highly symbolic, but the Irish tricolour is highly symbolic as well. So that is why in the north of Ireland, the head of state is Elizabeth II. They have the pound, and their government is primarily in London. In the south, they've got the euro, they've got their own president and Taoiseach, and they've got their own capital in Dublin. So this is where we are. Now, the people in Northern Ireland who were Catholic and nationalist were very, very keen to join the Republic and leave the United Kingdom. The Protestant community were not in favour of that. Unfortunately, terrorist groups broke out on both sides. The most proficient and the most famous is the IRA. And the IRA, I think the picture in the middle there is Enniskillen. On a Remembrance Day parade, they planted bombs and many people were killed. The picture at the bottom, some of you might know, is Manchester. In 1996, the IRA bombed Manchester. Architecturally, I think they did it a favour. but in terms of lives lost and ruined, it was an horrendous event. So you've got the IRA that not only target Protestants in Northern Ireland, but they targeted the mainland. I remember when I was 14, coming out of the cinema in Lancaster, and Lancaster was like a ghost town. There was police tape everywhere, and the IRA had tipped off the police there was a bomb. In fact, there wasn't a bomb. That was another of their tricks, I'm afraid. The picture on the bottom right, you can tell that that is a unionist or a loyalist part of Belfast. You've got the Union flag, you've got a royal coat of arms. If you were to go a few streets away, you might find that there are Irish tricolours and IRA posters up in windows to demonstrate their support for the Republic. In 1993, some of you might recall, there was a terrible bomb blast in Warrington. Now, the IRA had, I think in 1984 in Brighton, nearly murdered Margaret Thatcher and almost the whole government. They had murdered members of the royal family. The Queen had been targeted. Lord Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin, had been murdered. Soldiers were attacked. In 1993, the IRA put bombs in bins in Warrington. Now, I still get upset because those 2 children died. And I imagine that the youngest one couldn't even tell you where Northern Ireland was on the map. But I think the attack on Warrington was probably a game changer. Now, you might remember before I told you there were a whole load of Irish people emigrated, especially to the area around New York. And I think many people in America were perhaps channeling funds to the IRA because it was the good old cause. But when they realized that their money was being used to murder children, I think that put pressure on the IRA to slowly give up its violence. It ought to be said that there were loyalist paramilitaries as well who targeted Roman Catholic nationalist politicians. Dublin was attacked by, I think, the UDA or other loyalist paramilitaries. So Northern Ireland, despite the fact it's a lovely, pretty place and there is a sectarian divide, it has also been an incredibly violent place. Thousands of people were blown up and shot because of this disagreement as to whether Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom or separates and joins the Republic of Ireland. Okay, so we have there some background. It was a very potted history. And if you feel strongly about Irish history, you probably feel I've missed a great deal out. But Ian Paisley was a unionist politician. Now, he's the only man, I think, who has founded both a church and a political party. And on the right-hand picture there, the picture is Stormont. Ian Paisley stood in front of Stormont, and that is the Northern Irish Parliament. And for much of this period, it wasn't working. It was ruled, Northern Ireland was ruled directly from Westminster. But Ian Paisley is a unionist, or was a unionist and a loyalist politician. In other words, he was very much in favour of Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom. And you can see the Union flags that are being waved around him there. And the party he founded was the Democratic Unionist Party. And you can see there from their symbol, the lion, a symbol of Britain, the red, the white, and the blue. And the DUP was often considered the most extreme or passionate unionist party. Now, Ian Paisley is not liked by all people. He's probably more popular now he's dead than he was when he was a young man. But Ian Paisley considered it one of his life missions to oppose any move towards what we might call Irish unification. Now, Margaret Thatcher, who was a conservative British politician, you might expect she and Ian Paisley to have got on rather well. The full name of the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. Ian Paisley is a unionist politician. And yet in 1984-85, Margaret Thatcher decided that she would try and work with the Irish government to give them some say on the affairs of Northern Ireland, and it was called the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Ian Paisley despised Margaret Thatcher particularly strongly because of it. You can see there on the left, I think she's attempting to give a speech in the European Parliament, and Ian Paisley has walked to the front and heckled her. The picture on the bottom was a big protest called in Belfast in 1985. Ulster says no. And Ian Paisley famously said, "Where do the terrorists go to for sanctuary? To the Irish Republic." And yet Mrs. Thatcher tells us that that republic must have some say in our province. I say never, 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 never. A word-for-word rendition there of Ian Paisley's speech. And the Unionists people basically went on strike and on a protest because they did not feel it appropriate that what they thought was a foreign power should have a say in how Northern Ireland is run. Now, Ian Paisley often thought that the main Unionist politicians were desperate to give Northern Ireland away or compromise. Paisley was determined not to allow that to happen. Now, one of the questions I'm going to ask you towards the end is, to what extent is it appropriate for a Christian minister to become a politician? And, you know, was Ian Paisley a politician or was he a minister? In my research for tonight, I've watched a number of interviews with him. And in one question, he's asked whether he's Irish or British or an Ulsterman. And I think his answer was quite telling. He said, "I would describe myself as a child of God, first of all." Now, that, of course, is important. He would describe himself as Irish, but also as British and also as an Ulsterman. Now, again, he was considered to be the firebrand of Northern Ireland. He helped, I think, to bring down the premiership of Terence O'Neill, who was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who he thought was selling out. He absolutely hated the IRA. He said that the IRA was the military wing of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he never took that statement back. I'm not sure whether that's true. He went to prison a number of times, not for his faith, but because he was involved in street demonstrations against any suggestion of the southern government having a say in Northern Ireland, or also something called power sharing. Now, the nationalist community of Northern Ireland did have a pretty bad deal. For example, in Londonderry, or they would call it Derry, the population of Derry, the majority was nationalist, and yet the town council was always controlled by unionist parties. And you might think, well, if that's democratic, how does it work out? And Paisley acknowledged that it was probably wrong. Again, I think in Dungannon, there were 300 people waiting on the list for a council house, but no Roman Catholic had ever been offered a council house in 30 years. So there was discrimination against Roman Catholic people in Northern Ireland. And they started something called the Civil Rights Movement to try and get their representation increased. And Ian Paisley opposed it. He argued that the Civil Rights Movement was really just a plot to have a united Ireland. Now, in 1969 in Derry, there was something called the Battle of Bogside. There was so much fighting and violence on the streets that the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, couldn't cope. And unfortunately, in 1969, British troops were called in onto the streets of Northern Ireland. If I go Nope, I thought I had a picture of it. But there were streets which had soldiers walking on Northern Ireland, trying to keep people from killing each other. So we found the DUP in 1971, a breakaway from the official Unionist Party, opposed to power sharing. Now, power sharing is when you say, look, we know that the nationalist parties are never going to take power, but we'll share power with them. And Paisley was opposed to that. And his motto during that time was no surrender. And he formed various organizations, coalitions to prevent power sharing, because he considered it to be a real threat. In 1981, this is not something I'm not very pleased about. Every time we look at a hero of church history, there are elements of their lives of which we might not now approve. In 1981, he formed something called Paisley's Army, and 500 men on a bleak hillside met up and started marching around. They weren't carrying guns, but they were carrying gun licenses. And the implication is that these men were going to either defend themselves from the IRA or use violence to oppose Margaret Thatcher attempting to share interest of Northern Ireland with the South. Now, again, that's rather controversial. I mean, I would not expect anyone to amass 500 unarmed, admittedly, soldiers, much less a minister of the gospel. And again, various other controversial elements. When the Loyal Orange Order were marching through Drumcree in 1995, the police tried to stop them so as not to offend the Catholic community or to have violence. Again, Ian Paisley was there arguing with the police. They have every right to march where they want in Northern Ireland. There was a referendum in 1998 regarding power sharing. Paisley fought against it, although he lost. As a politician, he did fight for what we might call Christian principles. In 1977, he fought the, and I quote, Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign, and that was an attempt to oppose legalisation or decriminalisation of homosexual behaviour. It was successful until the European Court, I think, overturned it in 1982. So, you know, he was very much a Christian voice in politics. In 2007, that photograph was taken. Now, that is the most surprising photograph you might ever see. It's not just because Ian Paisley is laughing. In fact, the man has a wonderful sense of humour, but he was often, you know, seen as being rather depressing and firebrand. The man to his left is Martin McGuinness. Now, he was leader of a party called Sinn Féin, which means ourselves alone. That was the main nationalist, or perhaps the most extreme nationalist Republican Party. He had been a commander in the IRA. Yet there is Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley being photographed together. In fact, they worked together. In 2007, Ian Paisley, who had spent time in prison, who had catcalled politicians, who used to throw snowballs at the Irish president, himself became the first minister of Northern Ireland. Martin McGuinness, as part of a power-sharing agreement, became his deputy. And that is an amazing picture there. Now, again, some people on his own side said he sold out to the Republicans. I don't think he did. He persuaded the Republic of Ireland to give up its territorial claim on the north, and he insisted the IRA decommissioned their weapons. When those characteristics, those qualifications were met, the man who had been nicknamed Dr. No said yes. And in 2010, as out of recognition to the fact that he had done so much to bring about a form of peace in Northern Ireland, he was elevated to the British House of Lords, and it was called Lord Bandside. He wasn't called Lord Paisley because his wife Eileen had already been created Baroness Paisley. So husband and wife were independently committed to the British House of Lords. So that was Ian Paisley, the politician. He founded his own political party. He was a staunch supporter of the United Kingdom. I remember my grandmother, who was a Christian, she wasn't very keen on Ian Paisley. She thought he was a bigot. And there were many people who thought the same way. And yet, ironically, it was Ian Paisley who helped bring about power sharing. So he did, I think, a great deal for bringing about an end or a partial end to the troubles in Northern Ireland. Well, friends, we're not here this evening to talk politics. We're here to talk about a great man of Christian history. And I believe Ian Paisley is a great man of Christian history. Let's look at the man as a Christian. Now, that is Paisley on the right as a young man. He was born in 1926, the same year as the Queen. There he is as a young man. And that there is his father and his mother. His father, James, was a Baptist minister. Again, he was an opponent of Irish independence. And when the Republic broke away in 1922, he was determined, the father, to keep Northern Ireland part of the United Kingdom. Again, why is it that Protestants in Northern Ireland are so fond of the United Kingdom? Now, I'm a Protestant. I'm reasonably patriotic, and yet there's a great deal about my country I really do not like. I think the feeling was in the north that the Roman Catholic Church was so powerful in the south that there would be persecution or discrimination of Protestants in the north if they left the control of London. Now, we don't know whether that would happen. What we do know is that the Roman Catholic Church was indeed very powerful. Less powerful now. Ireland has become more secular, perhaps because of paedophilic priests and that kind of thing. There's an interesting tale that just a few weeks after Ian Paisley was born, his father, James, was out in the Austin car visiting members of his congregation. And one night he was stopped and at point blank range ordered out of the car. And there were 50 gunmen, and they were nationalists. And here is a prominent unionist minister, not their church, who has fallen into their hands. And almost certainly they would have murdered him. And yet Ian Paisley saved his father. Now, of course, I think here we can see the providence of God. It turns out the leader of this band of 50 men came out and had heard that James Paisley, the Reverend James Paisley, had just had his second son. And for that reason, he was allowed to get back into his car and drive away. Because they thought, being superstitious, it would be unlucky to kill a man when he had only just had a child. Interestingly, there are accounts of the IRA trying to kill Ian Paisley later on in life. There was an occasion when they drove to his church, knowing that he would be at the early morning prayer meeting. It just so happened that on that occasion, I think he'd had to leave early. And his daughter, Rhonda, came out, and the gunmen asked, is Ian Paisley in there? And no, he wasn't. So not only had God saved the father, but God had on a number of occasions saved Ian Paisley from the IRA. His father became the minister at Ballymena Baptist Church. And it was actually his mother, though, who led him to the Lord. His mother was teaching a Sunday school class about the lost sheep and how the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. And a young Ian Paisley said to his mother, I don't want to be a lost sheep. I want to be a saved lamb. At which point she led him through into the church. And one account says she sat him on her knee and she led him to the Saviour. So he was saved at an early age. When he left school, he went to work on his, I think either a cousin's or a friend's farm in County Tyrone, during which he ploughed and he sowed and he helped to run the farm. Now, one account says he wanted to be a sea captain. Another account says he wanted to be a farmer. But he often read the Bible. And one day while he was out ploughing, he really felt the call of God on his life. And he knelt down there on the soil and prayed that he was willing to go where God sent him, and he was willing to say what words God gave him, that he would be a preacher of the gospel. The next Sunday, he asked for a slot in the service that he might preach at the local mission hall. He said he couldn't think of any more words after 3 minutes, and it was a very humbling experience. Now, I think Ian Paisley was a great preacher. And I do have a clip. I'm not sure whether it will work tonight, but there are lots of his sermons online, and he had the most powerful lungs. I don't think he needed a microphone, but an incredibly well-versed and eloquent preacher. And yet when he started, he could barely occupy 3 minutes. He went down to Wales to study theology there and to become a preacher. He also spent some time studying in Northern Ireland, and he became the minister of the Ravenhill Evangelical Mission Church in East Belfast. And wherever he preached, there were crowds. He was an incredibly powerful preacher. Well, I want to look at the man as a Christian leader now. And it's remarkable because not only in 1971 did he form a political party, which became the biggest party in Northern Ireland, but he founded a church. And it's worth, I got this from the Free Presbyterian website. I'm going to read it to you. The church he founded was the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster. Now, in Barnoldswick, we've got a Free Presbyterian Church, but that's connected to the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. He founded the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster. For those who are interested, Presbyterian is a type of Protestant church. Now, in England, around the time of the Civil War, the Puritans were either Presbyterian or Congregational, like us. In terms of doctrine, I don't think there was much difference between them. It was really to do with church government. In a Congregational church, the congregation is independent of everyone else. In a Presbyterian church, you have a congregation and you have a membership, but you're part of the local presbytery. So the ministers will get together, the elders will get together, and it's a more centralized denomination. Now, Ian Paisley was growing up in the Northern Ireland that even today, most people went to church. And many people in Northern Ireland were part of the Presbyterian Church of Ireland. But let me read to you a little bit, which explains the founding of his church. And this is back in 1950. The committee of the Crossgar Presbyterian Mission Hall approached the 24-year-old Ian Paisley to determine whether he would conduct a gospel campaign in the town. Now, Ian Paisley was very Calvinistic, I think, in his theology, and yet he never lost the evangelistic impetus to go and bring in the lost. And so they asked him to preach the gospel at an evangelistic event. It says, after careful consideration and prayer, the date was fixed for February 1951. The campaign committee, the majority of whom were office bearers or members of Lissara Presbyterian Church, feeling that the mission hall would be too small, because wherever he went, he filled the building, they decided to ask their Kirk session for the use of the local Presbyterian church hall for the campaign. So the church session was like the elders of the local Presbyterian church. Their hall was bigger than the little mission hall, and the session unanimously agreed, because why would you have a small building when you can fill a big building and more people will get converted? You can see the logic. However, in what local people saw as evidence of the liberal agenda that was becoming increasingly evident in their church, the Down Presbytery meeting ruled that the mission should not go ahead in Lissara Church Hall. So the church session is what runs the individual church, but the presbytery is the wider grouping that controls the Presbyterian churches in that area. And the presbytery overruled the church session. You cannot use that church hall for evangelism. Now, that does not make sense to me, and it doesn't make sense to you. But the Presbyterian church was becoming liberal. Now, to many people today, liberal is a positive word. It means freedom, it means respecting people. Theological liberalism denies the gospel. It says that you're not sinful. It says Jesus only died upon the cross to show you an example of love. There is no hell to go to. Everyone goes to heaven. That is a pack of lies. And it was being propagated in the Presbyterian church in Northern Ireland. And so they put a stop to the evangelism. They had no problem with that church hall being used for dances on a Saturday night, but not that Christ crucified be preached. And evidently the local elders were overruled, but they only found out 90 minutes before something called they'd arranged a march of witness to advertise the mission. And so the Down Presbyterian ministers overruled the church session. And so basically a decision was taken to break away. Now that mission was actually still held. It was held elsewhere. And amazingly, it was held at the Keeley Street Mission Hall. 94 people were converted. Now, if we hold a mission and 3 people get converted, we'd think it was great. Paisley preached so powerfully, despite the persecution and the hostility of the church authorities, that 94 people were converted. And so the decision was taken that they would break away from the Presbyterian church, and that is why you've got the word free. They were freed from mainstream Presbyterianism, and the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster was founded. I seem to think that there are over 100 congregations now of the Wee Frees, the Free Presbyterians. They're not just in Northern Ireland. There are some in England. They're in America. They're all over, and they tend to take their lead from the church in Northern Ireland. Now, the church there, made of the red brick, that I think is the Martyrs Memorial Church on the Ravenhill Road. That was Ian Paisley's own church. So there are a number of them around, mainly in Northern Ireland. And the picture on the left there, that was a demonstration held against the Presbyterian church because they opposed the preaching of the gospel. Now again, very few nonconformist ministers in England wear dog collars now. The Free Presbyterians do tend to. So we might look at those and say, are they Catholic priests? Far be it. You know, these are ultra true Protestants. There's Ian Paisley and Eileen with their family and one of their grandchildren. And there is Ian Paisley preaching. Now, it's not clear, because he was a political demagogue, whether he's preaching politics or preaching the gospel. He often did both at the same time. And there are advantages to that, and there are disadvantages to that as well. The picture on the left there is Ian Paisley preaching on the street. I think that is Belfast City Hall. Now, every Friday afternoon, Big Ian, as he was called, preached the gospel. Now, I had a family gathering last weekend, and I knew that my uncle had been in the army in Northern Ireland, and he doesn't tend to speak about what goes on in Northern Ireland. I think that tells you a great deal. But I mentioned this evening I'd be speaking about Ian Paisley, and his face lit up Now, my uncle was part of his security detail, and he had to follow him round wherever he went, because obviously he was a target for the IRA, and he had 3 servicemen, I think, protecting him. And he said he was such a good man to work for. But he also remembers being with him on those Friday afternoons in the mid-1980s when Dr. Paisley would be out preaching the gospel. And I said, what was it like to guard him? You know, and he said he was the kindest, most cheerful man you could ever meet. And the only kind of threat he ever gave was, when we're out on the street, don't ever walk in front of me or I'll knock you over. So in other words, you can guard me, but don't walk in front of me. I think that's fair enough. So there's Dr. Paisley preaching. He was anti-ecumenical. And here we have some interesting pictures. Now, the ecumenical movement sounds good. Okay, it's all about different Christians, different types of church coming together, worshipping together, laying aside our differences. It sounds great. Unfortunately, it's not, because it's about merging Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. It's about merging evangelicals and liberals, people who deny the resurrection, who deny the atoning work of Christ, who worship wafers. I'm afraid with them we cannot fellowship. Now, Ian Paisley used to, on one of the occasions when he was arrested, he was actually protesting against the Presbyterian Synod, who were becoming ecumenical. And he marched through a Roman Catholic area to protest, and he was arrested. He was sent before magistrates. He refused to be bound over to keep the peace, and so he spent various months in prison. What's going on, though, on the 3 top pictures is that Ian Paisley is heckling the Pope. Now, Ian Paisley was an MP. He was the MP for North Antrim in Northern Ireland. He was also an MEP, a member of the European Parliament for Northern Ireland. And in 1988, John Paul II, the Pope, was invited to address the European Parliament. Now, Ian Paisley gave advance notice that he planned to denounce the Pope as the Antichrist. Now, Antichrist doesn't necessarily mean against Christ, it could mean in place of. And of course, we know that the Pope claims to be the vicar of Christ. Vicar means substitute. And there was the Pope addressing. And Ian Paisley stood at the back with a poster, John Paul II, Antichrist. And of course, there were a number of Roman Catholic MPs in there, including Otto von Habsburg, who allegedly punched him. They got rid of his poster and threw it away. Dr. Paisley, showing the initiative, got a spare one out of his pocket and did the same thing. Now, he was bundled away, he was punched and kicked, he received an apology from the head of security. But here is a man who had a wonderfully old-fashioned Reformation view of the Roman Church. And you'll find an awful lot of genuine Christians and evangelicals today who will say things like, the Catholic Church is just another church. Well, Paisley would have none of that. The Pope is the Antichrist, and I've got a quote from him early on in his life. He said, I'm not anti-Roman Catholic. I love the poor dupes who are ground down by that system. So he said he loved Roman Catholics, but did not love the Roman Catholic Church. And there was one of the protests. Now, when the Pope went to Glasgow, I think in the 2000s, he went to protest. I also think he flew across to the Vatican and did a bit of protesting as well. I'm not sure that probably did a great deal of good. From the Roman Catholic point of view, they called him Adolf Paisley, especially when he went across to the Vatican in 1962. When the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret went to meet the Pope, he said in rather colourful language they'd committed fornication with the Antichrist. So his language was very, very, very colourful. And when, you know, the popes died, he tended to celebrate. So he's a Christian leader. He's anti-ecumenical. He was fundamentalist, evangelical. He was also a prolific author. I'm afraid, I think I counted 56 books which he managed to write. The page on the right is a commentary he wrote on the book of Romans. I'm pretty sure he wrote it while he was in prison. So if you're going to lock up a man of God and he can't preach, what else would you do but write a commentary? And he wrote a great deal. You'll notice there he mentions the Jesuits. The Jesuits are a Roman Catholic order of priests whom Paisley called the Pope's stormtroopers or the Pope's Rottweilers. And he argued that the Jesuits were responsible for a great deal of evil in any country in which they operated. So he's anti-liberal, he's anti-Catholicism, he's anti-ecumenism. He died in 2014. And he probably died a far more popular man than he had lived. He possibly mellowed a little with age, but he never compromised on doctrine. Now, it might be that I can play you a little bit of his preaching, but I don't know whether the sound will come across. I won't try it for long.
Every second pew in the church, because if we did that, the crowd we have would look bigger. So they called in the joiners and they removed every second pew, and they were doing well. Would make the church look better. And then they decided that they would shut off a certain section of the church and introduce this society and that society, this recreational facility and that recreational facility. And you know, they thought they had done a wonderful job. They would now need to remove every third and fourth pew because the church has declined and will decline. When I went preaching on the Ravenhill Road 30 years ago and commenced my ministry, 60 people called me to be their preacher. When I had preached for 6 months, I had 30 left. And I remember one day, I wouldn't advise any preacher to do this, but when I was a young preacher, I was foolish. All young preachers are foolish. And I got so mad, I remember going into the pulpit, and I counted all the windows of the church, and I asked the stewards to open. And when they opened the windows, and I said, now open all the doors. Now I said, I started here with 60 people. We had a choir, the choir's gone. We had a superintendent of the Sunday school, he's gone. We had a treasurer, and he's gone. And I said, if there's any other person here wants to go now, the doors are open, the windows are open, and I'll sing the doxology while you go. Nobody went. 30 stayed. So I said, now we have 350 seats and only 30 people. How do you fill them? Consider your ways. So every Friday night, I went down to that church with 5 or 6 men, and we started at 11 o'clock at night, and we prayed upon every empty seat, and said, Lord, bring in sinners to fill these seats. And we didn't pray dry prayers. We prayed with tears in our eyes. We meant business. It was life or death. Either the church would go or it was finished. And we prayed. But you know, you don't just fill seats by prayer. You've got to put legs in your prayers. And we put legs in our prayers. And I went out every morning and I knocked upon the door and I preached. And I said to my man as we were praying, I said, you know what we want? We want the worst sinner on this road converted. Who's the worst sinner? So they decided the worst sinner in the road was a man over 70 years of age who was the worst drunkard in the area. You could see him every night going from the public house or the liquor shop after it closed, crawling his way up the road, holding on to the wall. So we concentrated our prayers on that man. We made him a target of old-fashioned Holy Ghost praying. And one night he came into the church, and a lot of the respectable people who weren't praying, they thought it was a miracle. me, that's a miracle. Says I, you know not about it. You prayed as long as I prayed for him. You wouldn't think it was much of a miracle. I thought God was mighty slow in answering the prayer. He wasn't saved the first night he came in, nor the second night. But glory to God, one night God saved him and sobered him and made him a trophy of grace. Man, it went round the district like wildfire. Do you know who Paisley has got converted? And his companions came to see what was happening. It was noised abroad that Jesus was in the house. And they got saved. And they all public and got mad. He says, if Paisley goes on, he'll be out of business. Thank God he is out of business today. It's closed. And then we had an unholy den hole of iniquity opposite the church, where young men were led astray and their lives were made unclean and their souls were destroyed. And I said to my young fellows, we've got to close that place down. So we concentrated prayer on it, made it a target for old-fashioned praying. And we meant business. And what happened? The man that ran it went bankrupt. And he came to me and he said, you know, I have to close. Says I, hallelujah for that. He said, what do you mean? Says I, God's answering my prayer. He said, you know, you could use that place. He said, I'll lease it to you for a certain rent. Says I never asked God for a lease on your place. I asked him to close it. I'm not reopening it. Says I wouldn't give you a penny piece for it. And it closed and closed forever. Hallelujah. We considered our ways. We got down.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope you were able to hear some of that. Let me see if I can get. There we go. Okay, so Ian Paisley died in 2014. He was the first minister of Northern Ireland. He was the moderator of his denomination, although, of course, he did step down from all that. There is some suggestion that perhaps the church actually kicked him off his role of moderator because they felt he'd compromised a bit too much with Sinn Féin. So there are some questions on there that, you know, we don't have to talk about them tonight. Time is limited, but we ought to at least consider them. You know, can Christians become political? Now, I used to be a member of a political party, and I resigned for two reasons, but I don't feel I can be one now. Ian Paisley, I think, would clearly have a different point of view. He was an MP, an MEP, a councillor, and the founder of a party. The other thing would probably be worth considering is Protestantism versus the gospel. Now, in Northern Ireland, you've got a great many people who will tell you they're Protestant. That doesn't mean they're saved. And there is a Christian culture over there, which we would find refreshingly wonderful. But what it might also mean, though, is that you've got people who might even attend church, but they wouldn't be converted. The Loyal Orange Order, you know, to be a member, to be an Orangeman, you have to agree with the Reformation. But again, that doesn't mean they're actually converted. So Ian Paisley will have had a lot of followers, not in his church, but his party, who were faithfully Protestant and didn't have much truck with Roman Catholicism. But does that mean they're converted? Well, of course, when we get to heaven, we won't be there because we're Protestant. We're there because Jesus Christ died for us and we believe in the payment that he made. That's a distinction to be made. Can we ever use violence to defend ourselves? Now, you know, Paisley had those 500 men and they were walking around with the military berets and the gun licenses. Again, Ian Paisley did a great deal to end violence in Northern Ireland. You know, the IRA decommissioned their weapons. He would not enter power sharing with Sinn Féin unless they did that. And yet there were suggestions during his lifetime that he was prepared to defend himself and his people with violence. You might also ask as well, because in Northern Ireland, evangelical Christianity is tied up with particular political parties, does that erect a barrier to some people getting converted? If I'm a Roman Catholic in Northern Ireland and I hear the gospel, but I feel that somehow not only am I leaving the faith of my family, but I'm also leaving my political loyalties behind, is that erecting a barrier which should not be there? I suspect that is an issue in Northern Ireland. And again, you know, did Ian Paisley mellow with age? I think he did, but he did so without ever compromising his political ideals, but also the gospel. He stood firmly against liberalism. He stood firmly against ecumenism. He stood firmly against the power of the Roman Catholic Church, which was strong in the Republic and in some parts of the North at that time. And, you know, I will open the floor up to any questions in a moment. But what I do recommend, listen to his preaching. Now, I did make a mistake a year or so ago. I used to listen to sermons while I was in bed. Don't listen to Ian Paisley when you're feeling tired, right? Because he tends to boom and shout, and whatever sleep you had, you won't have for much longer. But I find he was a really quite wonderful preacher. And even though it's only been on YouTube, he has moved me to tears. He being dead, yet speaketh. So I appreciate he's not everybody's cup of tea. There'll be people who don't like him either because he shared power with Sinn Féin or because he was such an ardent Protestant. But I honestly think he is a hero of church history, and I commend him to you for further study and for you to consider his preaching. Amen.